Hello, my name is Anna Brewer, and I'm the Homeless Voices for Justice team leader. Homeless Voices for Justice is a grassroots organization organized by people who are or have experienced homelessness. We seek to empower people experiencing homelessness and poverty, whose perspectives are often excluded from the development of policies and politics. We do this through protest, education, positive policy change, and reform. As a part of our annual You Don't Need a Home to Vote campaign, we are interviewing candidates running for local, state, and federal offices on the issues that are important to us and our community. Today, we're talking with Andrew Zarro, who is running for Portland City Council District 4. Go ahead, Ben.
Hi, could you please introduce yourself to the voters and tell us why you decided to run for City Council?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben. My name is Andrew Zarro. I am 32 years old. I live in Back Cove with my husband, TJ Zarro. We have 2 dogs and 4 chickens. I'm a small business owner now in Portland. I was in the advocacy world for quite some time in the nonprofit world, specifically working on criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform, and restorative justice practices. I then worked for a Main Street district. I've always been fascinated with small community-oriented businesses. And then I moved to Maine to work for the Smart Growth organization in the state. To be completely honest, right now is not an ideal time for someone like myself to be running for office. But I found myself in a situation where, we keep things that are important to us. We keep protesting. We keep getting frustrated and aggravated. And generationally, I think it's time that we show up in more than just a reactionary way. I think it's important for people to be running for office, even when it's inconvenient. But I believe that representation matters. In our city council, we haven't had a small business voice in quite some time. We haven't had an LGBTQ plus person in almost my entire life. And that's a problem. We need to be showing up together, representing the identities and the voices that are cornerstones in this community. And really living our values, which is what I do every day in my work with my shop and just in my my community work. But I think that we're lacking that on our council level. We're lacking that empathy, that compassion, and that community focus that I just think we're craving. We need that, and specifically we need this to show up in our public policy on a day-to-day basis. So that's why I'm running.
Go ahead, Cher.
Currently, Portland is experiencing an unsheltered homelessness crisis. There are many reasons why people don't use city shelters, including criminal trespass orders or restrictions, feeling unsafe at the shelter, feeling disrespected by shelter staff, needing to stay hidden for domestic issues, and more. The city has failed to adequately address these reasons why people choose to or are forced to sleep out. What would you do to address the unsheltered homelessness in Portland?
This is a huge issue, and it is really close to my heart. There have been times when I've had a hard time actually engaging on it as someone who experienced homelessness and houselessness as an adolescent with an incarcerated parent, and watching my mother, fight tooth and nail to protect my younger sister and myself from being homeless. So for me, this summer when we saw the encampment in front of City Hall, it was really personal because we see people who are ignored day in and day out. Yes, there are shelters. And yes, we know that only 50-something% were being utilized during this global pandemic, where there's even more pressure on top of what already existed pre-pandemic. What I saw that was really hard for me to digest was a lack of response from our elected officials to show up. It took almost a full week before we started to see people showing up and engaging our unhoused community, asking them what's going on, how are they feeling. And that's hard when you especially look at our city, which likes to say how progressive it is. And in some ways it is. But when it comes to taking care of the most vulnerable people who live here, I don't think it is. And I think we need to do better. This is not going to be an issue that's solved overnight. We're talking about this with our referenda that we're voting on this November as well. A lot of it has to do with affordability of housing access. I think redefining, the median income of what we consider affordable in the city. But I think there are a lot of concepts that exist in other cities that we could adopt here. With fall and winter right around the corner, we don't have a code blue system that could prevent people from being in the extreme cold. A couple of the points you just made in your question are incredibly accurate. This doesn't work for everyone. If there are criminal trespass issues, if there are domestic violence and abuse between individuals, sending everyone to a shelter just doesn't work for everyone. And like I said, being someone who lived that as an adolescent, there's just a lot of trauma and a lot of it's hard for people to be trauma informed in engaging our unhoused neighbors of what their very specific needs might be. But I think overall, we as a city have so much work to do to show up for the people who are the most vulnerable, and meet them where they're at, find out what their actual needs are, and then make policy based on that. Just seeing people and asking them and engaging them. And then going from there, not making blanket decisions based on the idea of what a houseless person needs. I didn't mean to ramble there.
Okay. Carolyn, you're on mute.
Forgetting about that mute button. Smaller site shelters, while Portland is moving forward with a new centralized homeless shelter and services center in Riverton, smaller site shelters are national best practice. Further, COVID-19 has shown us that large congregate settings are impractical and dangerous. Do you believe that Portland should move forward with the Riverton location, or that it should consider changing course to a smaller shelter model?
So I don't agree with the Riverton project. Right? I don't think that was the best path forward. That being said, it was decided upon, and if we go in a different direction, so say we have new counselors show up this November and we go in a different direction, my fear is that we're kicking the can down the road of actually helping the people who need the help. So while this wasn't an ideal solution, I agree that smaller community-oriented hubs are the path forward, and that's how we respond to people's very specific needs. I'm afraid that if we kind of take a step back and start over, are we actually serving the people who need help, and they need services, and they need housing, and they need food and medicine and access to education and employment? I don't know if it would be a good idea at this point to take a step back and redirect the energy and the resources. But I think it was a really missed opportunity to listen to the constituents of Portland. Portland has in any situation, I feel like there's a lot of NIMBY in Portland. And this was a big one that reared its head for a lot of people, because fact of the matter is, when it comes to our unhoused neighbors, it's so easy for people to just ignore them. I mean, if you look at it at any time you're at a red light in the city, how often do we see people literally just hand on the wheel, look forward? They don't even look at the people who are standing right next to them, who are human beings. So I think that was a big part of how the community engagement process, talking about the Riverton project, I think that was a failure by our elected officials to really hold people to, okay, why don't you want this in your neighborhood? Or, okay, what do you think would be a good solution or alternative? At the end of the day, we're talking about human beings, right? Like people who need help. And I think we need to continue to remind ourselves of that. So I don't know, to sum that up, I do agree with small community hubs, same with schools, right? Small community focused hubs that can address the specific needs of people. But I would be really afraid that we're going to lose the momentum that is been so challenging to build, and the people who are in need are going to be forgotten at the end of it. So.
Okay, Jim, you're up.
Okay. By definition, homeless voice of justice advocates have all experienced homelessness. Most of my life, my work as a master electrician, electrical contractor, allowed me to house myself, but it was my struggle with alcohol that caused me to experience homelessness. And so recovery issues are personally important to me. You know, I spent some time at Serenity House on Mellon Street that has closed down because of funding problems. And a lot of providers of recovery services have had to reduce their services for similar reasons. So do you have any thoughts or ideas on how to make recovery services more available to homeless and low-income people?
Yeah, and this is a huge part of the puzzle when we're looking at folks who have barriers to entry to housing or employment. If they are dealing with re-entry after incarceration, addiction is, and again, personal part of my life and my family. It can take you over, and that's when social services are really important for people to have access to getting back on their feet. So that one hits right here for me. I think that it's our job on the municipal level to confront this head on. And one time, I have a hard time when people kind of get up in arms about, well, we should be focusing on the economy, on attracting new businesses to Maine and growing our economy. And it's almost as if we need to say it's one or the other, right? Like, I believe that we can have a vibrant economy and take care of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I think that happens every year. We watch it happen with the budget and allocating, I think this year's budget there's a lot of problems for many reasons, but obviously it was also impacted by COVID. But I think allocation of just money, services to addiction and recovery services opens up a door for people to have access to so much more: housing, employment opportunities, education. I think people have a hard time looking at addiction, and there's a lot of stigma attached to it. And it's kind of the social perspective of, oh, well, you did this to yourself, which is so not true. And I think just having those conversations with people about, okay, everyone falls down, and it's our job to show up for one another when they need it most. And hopefully that doesn't happen to most people, but this is one of those things where it's not until it touches you personally that you realize the importance of doing that for your neighbors. So reallocating funds, that's a very easy act for our city manager and our city council to do when it comes to addiction and recovery services.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ben.
When I was homeless, I already had a housing voucher. Due to the lack of affordable housing, I couldn't get my voucher to use. Couldn't get my voucher to use. I spent 5 months homeless, which could have been avoided if there was more affordable housing. What will you do to expand affordable housing in our city, preserve affordable units, and prevent voucher discrimination?
So that's a huge one that we're talking about right now for November. And I'm really sorry to hear that you experienced that, because that is unfair and just really frustrating to hear that that happens in our city. Okay, so there's a lot that I think we can do. We're voting on a couple of questions this November that I think are in the right direction, but they're not getting it completely right, because it really is a huge, huge issue. First things first is we're not going to build our way out of affordable housing, an affordable housing crunch. There's a bigger picture here, and I think it has to do with, we need to look at affordable housing as a transportation issue, and having a robust public transportation that can actually get people in the city around without relying on everyone having their own vehicle, which I think is inherently a very main, like I'm from Vermont originally, but Northern New England really focuses on cars when it doesn't need to. And Portland's the largest city in the state. We need to, I was talking about this a little bit before, we need to look at the way we define and classify the median income in Portland for affordable housing, because right now we look at it as Greater Portland. So it's Portland, Falmouth, Cape Elizabeth, Scarborough, I think. So our median income is way up there. It's like $74,000, which is not the median income of most people who live in the city. So we need to redefine that, and we can, so that when we look at affordable housing, we're actually making it affordable for people that live and work in Portland. Continuing, and this is a big zoning issue, right? We need to continue to encourage inclusionary zoning in the city so that there is more access. We need to consider, and right now with the city's recode is in phase 1, we need to accessory dwelling units as an opportunity for people to increase density and diversity of socioeconomic status within the city, right? So Portland, like I said, is the biggest city in the state. It needs to start acting like that. And instead of encouraging like a sprawl mentality of we're going to be like this short but really wide city, we need to look at different ways to have accessible and affordable units for people. And that doesn't necessarily need to show up in a multi-unit. It doesn't need to be new condos. It can be people who have their house and they maybe turn their garage into a unit, an ADU, and that's an opportunity to get more housing and more stock on the market. But there are a lot of ways that we can approach affordable housing. Right now, I feel like we're doing it kind of in a silo, and we're looking at it just in a really specific way when we have an opportunity to be creative. And again, it's really easy to have these conversations when we're housed. And I feel like that's what we see from our council a lot of the time. It's a privilege to have that conversation. At the end of the day, how many people are we looking at that are they have a voucher, they're seeking housing, they're going through the process, but they're just falling through a system that's not really intended to support them. So, yeah.
Thank you. So both COVID-19 and police brutality have shown us that we need to focus on systemic racism in this country. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are overrepresented in both homelessness and poverty, especially here in Portland. What will you do to dismantle systemic racism within Portland social services, and how will you prioritize the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents?
Yeah, like with many other things, I think obviously, COVID is awful, and it's putting all of us to the test. But I think it did uncover, at least here, it uncovered a lot of what was already here, and it kind of brought everything to the surface. And I think that sense of urgency is an opportunity for us to act. Maine is the whitest state in the country. Portland is more diverse than the rest of the state, but I think that just gives you like a starting point for the city. And we know that COVID impacts people of color significantly more than white people. And Maine's numbers, although our numbers overall are good nationally, our numbers are terrible when it comes to per capita, the number of people of color in Maine who have contracted COVID versus white people. And I think that says a lot. I think that's showing us that we are not showing up for people of color in our state and in our city. I think we're starting to have some conversations now that are really important, and we are making movement. So the council already voted to ban facial recognition, and we're also voting on that as a referenda this November. And that's great. I'm glad we're doing that because it's racist, and we need to just start calling things out for what they are. As a white person, it is my job to do the work every single day and hold other white people accountable for dismantling systemic oppression and racism. It's not easy work, right? And I can tell you a bunch of times so far in this experience of running for local office, that there have been a lot of moments of inflammation where people are like, well, that's not who I am. I'm not racist, or I don't feel that way. It's hard for people. Also, sorry, there's an airplane flying over me, so I hope it's not too loud. It's really hard when you're talking about accountability in our city, and especially like our elected officials, to say, okay, systemic racism, it doesn't impact us every day because we are, if you are white, you are benefiting from it implicitly. And it's really easy to get defensive and to try to shut it down, but it's our job to not puff up, not shrink down, to show up for each other. So I think in terms of like policy, in terms of having the conversation, we are doing that with like the facial ban referenda. But I'm also seeing areas where we could do better, right? So the budget for fiscal year 2021, as I'm sure you know, a lot of like Parks and Rec lost 30-something jobs. Public Works lost a bunch of positions. The Portland Police Department didn't lose anything. And I think that's, oh, sorry, you're waving. I went over. Oh, I think you're muted.
Give us the 10-second wrap up.
Back to a budget, which I think is an applicable way for a city council and a city manager to actually like make actionable goals. Reallocate a portion of the police department's budget towards social services, towards conflict resolution services. Let's start putting living our values and putting our money where our mouth is, and saying, okay, if we are actively trying to be anti-racist and anti-discriminatory, let's fund programs and services that do that, and we can track them and measure them and show our community that we're listening instead of being tone deaf.
It's a hard question to cut someone off on because race equity is very important. Jim, you're next.
Yeah, I've been working with Homeless Voices Justice for 20 years, trying to ensure that people directly impacted or involved in the policy making that affects their lives. I remember in the past when there was an issue regarding the shelter coming for city council, we would negotiate with the shelter staff so people interested staying at the shelter could come up and testify at city council and still have their bed available for them when they got back to the shelter. So please tell us how you will incorporate unhoused people and people in poverty in your decision making as a city councilor.
Yeah, I think that's, and I will engage them. I will talk to them. I will recognize their humanity, which again is the part that really upsets me that I saw with the encampment. You know, we were there almost every day, dropping off coffee and pastry and just talking to people. And it's not so much virtue signaling; it's just showing up for people who need you, right? And I just have a really hard time when we have elected officials at the city level, at any level of government, who are completely ignoring constituents, right? Just because you're unhoused or in transition, it doesn't mean you're not a valid part of this community. So giving opportunities for access. If someone who has a bed in a shelter wants to go testify or even go to a city council meeting, make that accessible for them. Zoom is great. Being able to sit in my living room and tune into a city council meeting is great for my accessibility. I'm able to plug in, but not everyone has access to the internet or their own computer. We can think of creative ways to engage people who might have those barriers so that they can be participants in their local government, because they deserve that, regardless of how they are housed, if they are housed, and bringing city council to them, right? Bringing local government to the people who live here. Regardless of where they live. So I think just honestly, based on what we're working with right now with our current council, just having those conversations, bringing that up regularly and asking the question of, who's not here right now? Oh, I don't see anyone from the unhoused community. How do we get to them? How do we show up for them and make sure that they are part of this conversation? And I think with candidates like myself and a couple other candidates that are running right now, that's exactly what's going to happen in this next iteration of city council. And I'm excited to do it because it's long overdue.
And we have one last question from Carolyn, who is on mute. So remember to unmute yourself.
There we go. Now, if you are elected to the City Council, will you work and vote to uphold the City of Portland's longstanding 35-year commitment to provide emergency shelter to every person in our city who needs it?
Yes. And I think we have a lot that we can build on it with. I'll give you an example. My parents, well, I've since lost my mother recently, but my parents worked very hard to build out a code blue system in upstate New York, which I brought up at the beginning of this call. I think we have opportunities and obligations to uphold this 35-year commitment, but also do more, because this is not an issue that I think is going to be going away anytime soon. Ideally, we will resolve this and everyone will have an equitable shot at housing and employment and quality of life in Portland. That's something I would like to see. But I think not only do I commit to uphold this, but seek opportunities and cases in other cities where communities are doing more than we're doing. Because I think we can. I think that the mentality of us or them, vitality or the opposite, that needs to go away. We can do it. We can do both, and we can do it well, and we can lead by example nationally how a small New England city takes care of everyone who lives there.
Well, thank you, Andrew Zarro, for joining us today. We're really excited to share your answers with our community, and we appreciate you making time.
I appreciate you offering me this opportunity to connect with you, and sorry if I got a little emotional about this, but this one really is so important to me, and I would like to believe that in about a month's time we are going to be on a very different path forward of looking out for one another. And I really thank you for the work that you're doing. It's really important, and these perspectives are necessary for an inclusive government. So thank you.